Hello, Matt.
Hey Dan, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you? Hey,
Good.
thanks for partaking in this data talk as a guest. Matt here is a upcoming data scientist at Meta. He used dataandtv.com, especially the online subscription course, as a way to prepare for Meta's data science interview. And I've basically invited him as a guest to basically give him a chance to talk about his career experience, what are some cool things that he worked on, and then basically talk about some general interview prep tip for data science interview and along with Meta's interview. And then as a bonus content at the end of this video, what we're going to do is we're going to go through a case problem together based on WhatsApp. So definitely watch this video end to end, and I hope you find this video helpful. So without further ado, Matt, I'd like to give the floor over to you, and could you just talk about your overall career journey for those who do not know who you are?
Yeah, sounds good. And before I get started, I just want to say thank you for putting together the data interview platform. Like as you mentioned, it was kind of critical and I think my success in the interview. But a little bit about myself. So I've been in data analytics probably around 5 years at this point. Started off in consulting, got a kind of a range of experiences in building dashboards, ETL development, some um, machine learning type stuff. The hours kind of got to me a bit. So recently I joined a fintech company. So in the finance space, dealing a lot with like stocks. In my role, I build a lot of like dashboards, work with a lot of stakeholders across the company to solve problems with data. And recently I've had the urge to get into a true data science career and really with like a product focus. And that's what really drew me to Meta and some of the products that they have in their portfolio. So I gave it a shot, updated my resume, and went through the interviews and stuff. And things panned out in my favor, and I'm happy to be joining them in a couple weeks here.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's always very interesting to see people with a similar kind of route that I've also personally taken because I looked at your LinkedIn profile, and for those who are interested in definitely connecting with Matt, I'll provide a link to his profile down below in the description of this YouTube video. One thing that really caught my attention was that, personally for me, I started out as a consultant at Booz Allen Hamilton, and eventually I got into a fintech company at PayPal, and then I got into the really, one of those FANG company, which was Google for my case. So I saw that, you started your career in KPMG, and then you started over to Vanguard, and then now you're going to be joining Meta pretty soon. So it was very interesting to see that similar parallel there. So I'd like to kind of start with maybe like the early days of your data science career. Like, how did you kind of start your way into data science anyways? I think this is really helpful for, aspiring data scientists who want to actually break into the field.
Definitely, yeah. So I did have like a data science, I guess, background in undergrad. So I went to a college called St. Joe's outside of Philadelphia, and they actually had a program called Business Intelligence and Analytics, and it was kind of like your intro to data science course, if you will. We touched on everything from like intro to statistics to some data mining concepts to some intro to like SQL and database type stuff. So you kind of got that well-rounded background, and after kind of going through some of my courses in my major, I was like, I love this stuff. Definitely want to continue on with my career. Where can I get a job in it? So that was kind of what ultimately led me to that. And I think one of the big things I was looking for out of college was as much experience as I could get as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And that being said, I think consulting fits perfectly into that kind of goal. Is like, hey, you can work with 15 clients in your first year of work, all in different industries, on all different sorts of projects. So I think as soon as I got a role at KPMG, I was like, this is awesome. It kind of aligns with what I wanted for my first job, right? This wealth of experience. And then later in my career, I felt like if I had all that broad experience, I could really know quicker what I want to do and which pillar I really want to like specialize in or, pursue more full time. And that's kind of been like the driving factor, I think, in my career so far is like get as much experience as I can. And then kind of like filter through it and right, where do my passions lie and then like pursue that next. So that's been kind of the path I'm on, and it's taken me to Meta in a few weeks. So really excited.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what was one really cool thing that you worked on at KPMG?
Yeah, so one of the cool things we get to work on, this was more like an internal project, but I actually worked with some senior like partners on developing a recruiting like analytics and dashboard suite where these partners as they're going to campuses across the country to do like recruiting type efforts, get new people to the firm, get people interested in the brand. I actually built out this like dashboard tool and kind of like pipeline of gathering data from all these prospective students and across the country, and we were able to like plot it and almost have this real time like heat map that partners could show. Uh, you know, as they go to your campus, they could select like a drop down. It shows you alumni currently at the company. It pulls up their profile information, some analytics around like tenure and the industries they support. So I think one of the outcomes of that is like students immediately had contacts that shared a similar background that they could kind of reach out to, connect with on LinkedIn, to go to networking events, etc. So I think it was a really cool experience because it kind of connected students entering the workforce with
Yeah.
alumni already in the workforce. So it's kind of a really cool experience.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's awesome that you're providing this type of experience where you can bridge the basically this connection between the students who are trying to get their first entry level job and the recruiters and the hiring managers. Yeah. So I'd like to kind of talk a little bit more about like maybe your experience at Vanguard. So I saw that you built some data visualization over at Vanguard. It seems like there were some pretty cool like analytic based projects that you were working over there. So what did you do over there?
Yeah, definitely. So right now I'm on like a data science team. We support a lot of different teams across the enterprise. Um, as you can guess, like being Vanguard, we're a finance focused company. So a
Yeah.
lot of our use cases are dealing with like financial data, clients, account information, monitoring for like fraud detection, etc. One of the cool things that we as a company are interested in, and I think the industry overall, is the idea of process mining. So how can we leverage this log data generated from, you know, dozens of systems internally, externally that we're collecting data on? How can we like make sense of this and start to identify trends in this log data?
Hmm.
So one of the things I've been working on for the past year or so is the tools around process mining, basically sifting through millions and millions of log type data and starting to get that full lineage of what happened, what's business as usual look like, what are variations of that, can we detect these anomalies maybe in real time before they kind of lead to better things.
Got it, got it. That's really interesting. By the way, back when I used to work at Google, the foreign contributions was actually managed by Vanguard.
Oh, really? See, full circle.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And now as a self-employed individual, I'm trying to establish my individual retirement account,
Yep.
along with basically self-employment 401k contribution account. So I'm planning to use Vanguard actually.
Definitely. Yeah, it's a great company.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so that's really interesting. So now I'd like to kind of segue over to just a general interview prep that you did. So how did you kind of start your process of, I guess, jump starting your interview prep for these companies?
Yeah, sounds good. So I'd say if I had to like time box my interview prep, I'd say it was around 2 months of like full force, dedicated kind of prep time. And the first week of that was a lot of like what I call orientation type stuff. Basically going out to LinkedIn, searching 15 to 20 different job descriptions for data science and starting to see in my head like what are the commonalities between these roles where I can invest my most time studying for the greatest return. So every role had Python, every role had SQL. Some roles had A/B testing, some didn't. So I was really just trying to get a sense of, like what the field's looking for in terms of skill set to help me guide my studies. I'd say another thing that I did in week one was start the mock interviews early. I can't stress that enough. I probably did over 50 mock interviews at this point, just to kind of get up to speed on that. And the first few were absolutely horrible. I was fumbling over my words. I didn't have any structure. I was rambling. So I'd say like the biggest thing I could stress would be start the mock interviews week one. And going back to your platform, like that Slack channel, I met so many individuals who were interviewing for similar product data science roles at Meta specifically, that I was able to mock interview with. And, a few of them also got the role. So I have some coworkers to meet in a few weeks, but I would say do the mock interviews as early as possible for three reasons. One is you obviously get better at learning the structures, learning how to talk through these ideas in real time on the spot, which is critical. I'd say two is you get a gauge of your competition, right? I mentioned I was terrible when I first started. After a few weeks, you start to see yourself like grow in terms of your responses, your answer structure, etc. And you also get to meet with some really smart data scientists already who are at this level. So it kind of is a really good gauge of where you're at, where you need to get to, and how you're progressing over the weeks. And then I'd say third is just to meet, expand your network. I met a ton of people who ultimately got jobs all over, some of them at Meta, but I've kept in touch with them for the past few weeks too. So it's been great.
Yeah, no, it's been very interesting to see how people would pair up for these mock interviews through the Slack community group that's managed the data interview service, and like one thing that I definitely encourage for any candidates who are currently preparing for data science interviews is that more often than not, they'll kind of think about it as like, okay, I'm going to read all the resources out there. I'm going to practice on my own. And then maybe I will do some mock interview and then do the interview. Basically the mentality is like, okay, I'm going to be 100% prepared and then do the actual mock interview or the actual interview. Don't do that. You're only building up unnecessary pressure for yourself. Rather do those in synchrony of one another. So do this in parallel, because what it's going to do is you're getting a feedback loop. You're starting with the minimum viable product, which is basically yourself not clearly knowing what you're going to expect in these mock interview setting or the actual interview setting. But then once you go through it, not only you get that anxiety and the fear of someone out of the way, but at the same time, you're learning, okay, these are the topics I definitely need to hone in on. So this constant feedback loop is going to be ultimately helpful in terms of being very, very effective.
Yeah, 100%. I'd say one thing to add on there is like, after doing so many mock interviews, you get into the actual interview on site and, you're just relaxed, right? You've done this so many times before where your nerves, traditionally in the past, like my voice is shaky, like you get anxiety. There's like no better feeling in the interview when it counts, like being relaxed, calm, and being able to think through. And the only way to get there is through mock interviews.
Yeah. And the other very important thing is that, like you're in your zen, but also at the same time, you're bringing, you're almost sort of making the interview not like, okay, there's the interviewer and the interviewee sort of thing, but it becomes conversational, and that's one thing that I just want to emphasize so much, because I recognize that, either whether I'm working through clients or, whether I watch other contents out there, sometimes they really emphasize this like approach to interview question with this framework. Here's step one, this is what you need to say. Step two, what you need to say. Yes, that kind of structured response matters, but what matters a lot more is whether you can make it conversational. Are you kind of engaging it in a way where, if you were an actual data scientist at that company and this interviewer was your colleague, how do you interactively kind of like work through this problem together? That's what matters more,
Definitely.
Yeah. So that's really cool. So are there any kind of general, technical prep like SQL or coding sort of things that any kind of advice on that in terms of how people can prepare for those topics?
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. So I think for the majority of the interviews I went on, Meta and others, the first round is usually that screening round, right? Where it's a technical with the case study. And everyone knows there's a bunch of other like stat and probability stuff that is also part of these roles. But I would say front load your study with SQL and case studies. And the reason is like, if you don't get past the tech screen, you obviously don't get to the on-site round. So it's like, you got to be really good at these first two things before you can even focus on the other ones. And one of the ways I did that was I did probably at least 30 to 60 minutes of SQL exercises a day just to like stay sharp. You want to be able to write out window functions like
Yep.
in your sleep. You want to be able to, you know, differentiate between union and union all like on the spot and recognize those patterns. And, you know, there's no secret to it. The only way to get there is investing the time and every day consistently.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a similar tactic that I use to prepare for interviews that had these SQL and coding problems as well. So personally for me, kind of like basically I invested about 30 to 60 minutes on a daily basis, and I was solving about like 4 to 5 problems a day. And I did that like starting the first month of my prep. There's really no magical bullet on this one. It's just a matter of practice again and again.
Yeah, and on that point, I've seen some candidates who I've mock interviewed with. There's limited prep resources out here, so if you do enough of them, you start to memorize the answers. And I would highly suggest like don't try to memorize them, because I've seen candidates, recognize, oh, I've seen this pattern, I've seen this problem before, how can I solve it? And the problems you're going to get on the interview aren't any ones you've seen before. So if you are strictly trying to memorize things, I would suggest don't do that. Try to understand the concepts.
Exactly. Yeah. Focus on the concept, build out logic. And then from there, you're going to start recognizing patterns of how to crack these SQL or coding questions off the cuff.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of, I guess, just general, like, obviously, one thing Meta loves to cover is like product sense questions, but also like other product data science roles at different companies as well. They love to ask these product sense questions. How do you go about preparing for these product sense questions?
Yeah, definitely. So I think in general, when you're talking about like product sense case studies, there's like 3 or 4 buckets, and really it comes down to like creating a metric, right? Being able to understand all the different parts of a metric and what you're tracking. So that's like one of the type of case studies is around come up with a metric to measure success, measure value, measure something. The second type of case study is like investigative, right? So the business has a key metric and it's declined, it's increased, it's spiked. Find out why. And the third one is around designing an experiment. So being a product focused company, a lot of them want to test what are your skills around designing an experiment to, drive a change in a metric for the business. So those are like the 3 types of core case studies. I've seen some companies ask ones around like, how would you improve a product? Those are also really interesting, but I feel like they're maybe more on the product management side of things from what I've seen. For the data science roles, it's really those first 3.
Yep. Got it. Okay. That's cool. All right. Do you have any final sort of general tips for candidates out there in terms of how they should prepare for data science interview before we segue to the next part, which is actually going through a case problem together?
Definitely, yes. I just want to reiterate, start your mock interviews early, regardless of, where you think you're at. The first one's going to be probably a little rough, but you'll get so much better every day, and it'll help you tremendously in every round of the interview. Secondly, practice SQL every day. I know it's sometimes not the most fun thing to do, but that repetition and consistency will, pay dividends in the tech screen when it counts.
That's awesome. All right. Thank you so much for that tip. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to share a screen. I also actually give you a link to this Google document, and what we're going to do is we're going to flesh out this document together. Okay. All right.
Sounds good.
Okay, so this problem is basically involving the WhatsApp, and the problem is, how would you detect spammers on WhatsApp?
Definitely. Yes, this is an interesting problem. I think one of the things I'd first try to do here is start to ask clarifying questions around what's a spammer. So the way I'm kind of thinking about spammers are users who are not on the platform to engage in conversation, right? They're trying to push external links. They're trying to, sending massive group chats to as many numbers as they can get. and spamming you, right? That's what
Yeah.
spam is. So one of the first things I would do is try to really narrow down on what's spam mean in the context of this problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I would say that I do agree with the idea that basically there's a bit of this like malicious intent behind what they're trying to do. And so what spammers will typically do is that in a form of like a automated fashion, or they're almost sort of copy pasting the same message again and again to as many users as you can. And typically the message content itself will have some sort of link. It's like a clickbait essentially.
Right.
It might say something along the lines of, go to this link because it's going to give you $30 or something like that, right? And once the victim goes through that link, they might enter some like credit card information or something like that. And next thing you know, they get their important stuff like stolen, right? So I would say like that would be like the nature of what spammer is.
Definitely. Yeah, that makes sense. The next thing I try to do is come up with some features, right? So how we know what spammers are, how are we going to think about tracking this and, knowing some data points we can look at to give us confidence one way or the other. And I kind of like to think of features in terms of like buckets. So the way I'm thinking is there's three buckets in my head. One is metadata. So, data around that phone number or that user account. And I can flesh out some additional like features in a minute. The second one is more transactional or activity. So what have these users done? What evidence do we have, based on activity? And then the third one is more of like an aggregate ecosystem metric. So where does this activity compare in terms of all of our users? So those are kind of the three buckets I'm thinking of in thinking of features and how we might be able to leverage this data to create these features and identify spammers.
Got it. One real quick. What was the last point that you just mentioned there?
Ecosystem, like aggregate level metrics.
Okay, got it. Yeah, aggregations.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so I think one thing that I think these are really good data sources. There's definitely a lot of information that can be useful. I also think one thing that we need to consider is also how we would actually get the labels in this case, right?
Yes.
Because in order to build out this, basically what this question is asking is, whether you're building a rule-based approach or a machine learning approach, how would you ultimately flag a user as spam based on their behaviors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in order to do that, we need to think about how we're going to actually get the labels.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the labeling question, I think, can be answered in two ways. One is we can kind of have this like human in the middle approach where we present them data for perhaps manual review and they label it saying, nope, this looks good, or yep, this is spam. Let's label it as spam. The other way we can potentially use it is on the initial pass, use some rule-based approach or perhaps get our hands on existing data that might have been manually reviewed by some security team to identify patterns that historically represented spam on the WhatsApp platform.
Yeah, and I think another really good approach to getting labels is actually crowdsourcing it from the users themselves. Because what happens on WhatsApp is that when you send out a message, when you receive a message and this person isn't in your contact list, then a pop-up is going to appear in the message saying, do you accept this contact, or do you want to report this as a spam? So that's another critical information that we can get by having users actually generate those labels for us.
Definitely, yeah, that's a great point to include. Historically, sometimes I am hesitant for user-based feedback, but I think in the case of like fraud and stuff, as you mentioned, like users are more than happy to stop people from spamming them. So they're usually more likely in this survey case than other survey type cases on the platform.
Yeah. But also if we think about it, in the world of like credit card like fraud detection, because I came from that world before working at Google, is that you get the labels actually from the victims,
Right.
because the victim will report saying that, hey, I got my credit card information stolen, and so that's how you would actually accumulate the labels over time. And then eventually, that's once you have some initial set of labels from that are generated from the users, there's essentially a manual reviewers who are going to generate some rule-based approach.
Hmm.
And before a possible credit card fraud can happen, they will look at a user's profile along with their transaction history, and then preemptively, block this user based on whether they're likely to be fraudulent or not. So I think a combination of all the three things that we just mentioned are ultimately ways we can get labels.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep. Okay. All right. So I think we have some general kind of prerequisite, the information that we need in order to start kind of solving this problem. So now we need to think about the methodology of how we're going to actually detect spammers.
Yeah. So there's two ways I'm kind of thinking about being able to detect this. One is, given that we have the labels, we can leverage like a machine learning technique, specifically a classification type model, thinking like logistic regression here, maybe a random forest or decision tree model.
Yep.
If we don't have any labels and say this is the first time as a business we're looking to solve this problem, we might be able to leverage some basic statistics and distributions to identify populations of potentially spammers. So do you have a preference on where I start?
So let's actually assume that so we've essentially gotten the labels through the three things that we just mentioned there, and so I think the next thing that we should definitely cover together is how we're going to actually build a classification model. And one thing I just want to provide there is that obviously the spam in this case is going to be a low probability event model, right? So we have to think about how we're going to consider the fact that we're dealing with low true positiveness in this case, compared to messages that are not spam.
Yeah, definitely. So anytime you're dealing with like fraud, as you mentioned, you have the inbounds class issue. So that raises a couple of concerns in my head in terms of how we're going to evaluate this and what are the metrics we really want to look at. But going back to this firstly is like, how are we going to deal with this imbalance from building a model perspective? There's a number of techniques we can use to help address the bias that's introduced by this imbalance in class labels. One that comes to mind is it's called SMOE. It's like synthetic minority oversampling. And what we're doing here basically is oversampling our true positives, right? Our smaller class here, to try to make them more prevalent in our training data set. So our model picks them up and we're able to develop something meaningful to capture us in real world.
Yeah. 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 And then there's also the downsampling as well, which is basically removing some of the non-spammer user group in this case as a way to bring that ratio a little bit more optimal for building a model.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So that's definitely something that we should consider as well. And I think we also briefly discussed what type of model we're going to use in this case, and I think logistic regression and random forest should be fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just jumping in here, logistic regression, random forest are obviously both classification models. Traditionally, random forest is usually better performer, and the reason why it's known as an ensemble model. So actually, under the hood, it creates a bunch of individual decision trees, and it is able to kind of like aggregate all these decision trees predictions and roll it up into a single one. So most of the time, a random forest is going to be slightly better than logistic regression. But
Yep, definitely. Good point. Okay, so in terms of how we're going to actually measure the performance of the model, obviously in this case, um, because we're dealing with imbalance, we don't want to use accuracy. We want to use metrics like AUC in this case.
Mm-hmm.
Another set of metrics that we should definitely consider are F1 score, precision, and recall.
Definitely. Yeah, I totally agree with you there.
Yep. Okay. All right. So one thing that we should also consider is at what stage do we basically flag a spammer, a user as a spammer, right? So if we think about it, there's a user journey around this, right? So basically, a user is going to sign up on WhatsApp, and then they'll start initiating messages, right? So we want to basically use either something about their profile information during the sign up stage or during the time when they're actually messaging, and based on the way they message, basically flag this user as a spammer.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, we need to think about what the prediction point is.
Yeah.
Do you have some initial thoughts about that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. I can kind of think of it from like 2 points in the user journey. One is if this spammer has been seen before as a spammer, we can obviously stop them before they are even ever able to send a message, right?
Yeah.
So there's that point. And then 2 is almost like the prediction point, I think, would be sending messages over a certain threshold. And the thinking here is like, there's a ton of normal, users who are sending messages, but once they send too many messages in too short of a time, there's that fine line between regular user and probably spammer. So we can have this almost like threshold at the sending message stage for the prediction point.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in fact, generally speaking, when we think about like building a fraud model, it's not that the fraud model will, it's not that a single fraud model will only tackle the entire life cycle of a fraudulent user. There's a fraud model that's built in for every stage of a user journey. So we're talking about the sign up stage, and then maybe the first event stage, the third event stage, the fifth event stage in this case, right? So I definitely like the idea of, first of all, targeting users at the registration stage. So basically block them out even before they will send out a first message, right?
Right.
And key information like have they been blacklisted before? Well, how do we go about doing that? Well, if they've been blacklisted before, then we would know what email address, the phone number, IP addresses are associated with that blacklisted account, right? So we can use those type of information as a way to basically flag a new user as a spammer in that registration stage.
Definitely, yeah.
And I think another key information we could definitely use are aggregations as well. So we can look at, for this given user's IP address, how many new accounts did they try to generate the past, 1 day or 7 days or 30 days, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And compared to the normal user who might only establish maybe one account for a given IP address, spammer, on the other hand, their intention is to create as many accounts as they can so they can really disseminate this clickbait messages as many as they can. So they'll have a very high values in terms of that type of aggregation-based feature.
Right.
Yeah. And then, so I think we could definitely build a model at the register stage. And then the second model we could potentially build is basically the early activity stage, like what you mentioned, which is let's track their behavior in the first couple messages and see whether are they generating a lot of messages over a short period of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And just to add on to that early activity stage, going back to like your basic statistics, looking at a distribution of messages sent by user per day, I think will give you a really idea of what's the norm on the platform to begin with. And then from a a spammer percentage, maybe you select like the 95th or 99th percentile as like that threshold that, is really good evidence of spammy behavior.
Yep.
So I think, going back to simple statistics would help a lot in this case.
Yep, definitely. And I think other really good information we could consider is, in a way, like it spam, like especially those like very kind of clever spammers. What they'll do is like they'll use automation, right? Like they'll automate messages. And so if we think about what is an organic behavior on, messaging service, is that a user is going to type something, and oftentimes, when you're on WhatsApp or Messenger, you'll see this like blob indicating
Right.
that someone is typing something, right? But a spammer, on the other hand, they'll either, if they're doing it manually, they'll just copy paste things, or they'll use automation as a way to just send a message very quickly,
Yeah.
right? So perhaps the average time it took to actually type out the message, that could be another key information as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like the TTS would be almost zero, right? If it's
Yeah,
spammer just copy and pasting bulk messaging. So I think that would be a great metric.
yeah, yeah. And of course, I mean, there's dozens of other potential signals that we could generate. But in essence, I think this kind of captures the heart of, I guess, what spammers would do and how we would actually go about detecting a spammer in this case.
Definitely. Yeah, and just one more data point we could look at just for the viewers is like messages sent versus messages received. Idea here is spammers don't care about
Yeah.
responding to message, right? They're going to be so skewed on the sending front that they will probably have close to zero messages received. So that would
Yeah.
be another, I think, dead giveaway of a spammer.
Yeah, yeah, that's another really good signal as well. Okay, yeah. So obviously, there's a lot more that we can cover through this topic, but in essence, I think this pretty much captures the idea of how do you go about approaching a problem like this. Thank you for your participation in this one.
Cool. This is a fun one.
Yeah. Okay, so before we kind of end the sort of practice session together, I do want to maybe kind of go through some behavior questions together. Obviously people do have these behavioral rounds in these interviews, and I think it's a really good kind of demonstration. So we can kind of take turns. Is there a behavior question you'd like to ask me, and then I can also ask you as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I'd say just to like preface this, one of the things I think they look for in a lot of these interviews is data scientists are kind of these like rare employees who are super technical, super business savvy, and can operate kind of in between. And they really look for that like cross-functional type answers, right? Of you engaging with stakeholders as well as like demonstrating technical knowledge. So I'd say like as you're thinking about some of these behavioral ones, think of experiences where they involve multiple teams, multiple stakeholders, multiple technologies, and try to like answer the questions in that lens.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Going on to the question, one that I like to ask is like, what's a recent project you used to influence with data?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. So I would say the most recent project would really be the last project I delivered at Google. So I work with the financial analysts over in the technical infrastructure team, specifically within the network pillar. So the technical infrastructure at Google, they basically deal with building out data centers to support basically internet traffic for like Google Search, Cloud, YouTube, Google Maps, and so forth. So it's a very critical functioning team. And the financial analysts over there, what they're really concerned about, expenses. And usually expenses can break down into two factors, operating expense or capital expenditure, or CapEx. And what CapEx basically is that you're going to invest maybe $1 million tomorrow because you expect the network traffic to be much higher, because if you think about YouTube and Google Search, they're on a very sort of exponential growth in terms of the traffic that is required to support that, right?
Right.
So it's like an investment for tomorrow, and what they're trying to calculate is how much should we invest this year, the next year, basically a 5-year horizon. And so traditionally what the financial analyst would do is they would have like a manual approach, like some business heuristics, like very clever logic and Excel spreadsheet as a way to estimate this, right? And as I was a finance data scientist at Google, one of the things that we need to do, what we propose is like, we can definitely automate this for you guys, and we can build a much better model, through machine learning. And so this is really an opportunity for me to kind of lead that sort of, okay, this is how much we should expect. And, hopefully it's also helpful in terms of your planning process as well. So I started by getting all the data sources that I needed. So I had the historical capital CapEx spending to be able to support this network traffic. And then I used this time series model. There was a lot of models that I was kind of tinkering with. It took a lot of trials and errors. But all in all, what I ended up using was a model called Bayesian Dynamic Linear Model. Basically, it's just a Bayesian-based linear model. And it allowed this trajectory of what this 5-year horizon is. And I used time series cross validation as a way to show that this model is actually better than the business baseline. And so once we have proven out this capability, we rolled it out, and the financial analysts agreed to use this for their 2022 planning. So that was a really good kind of experience of being able to deliver something and also just kind of lead that part of that process.
That's awesome. Yeah. So it sounds like you presented an idea and they actually ended up implementing it for the next year's predictions.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Yep. Okay. So, so I'll ask the same question over to you. So could you give an example where you led something with data?
Yeah, definitely. So I mentioned earlier, like there's a big topic in the industry known as like process mining, which is basically gathering insights from log-based data from internal systems, external systems, etc. So one of the projects I was working on was trying to come up with a prototype to showcase like the strengths of process mining as a tool and a methodology, as well as kind of getting adoption from these business teams on how you can use the output of this to, drive a decision or, improve a process, etc. So as part of this project, I went around to various teams in the business, started to talk with them about what are some of your gold source systems that you're leveraging in your business, generating data from, using as like workflow management type tools. Started to get a list of them, get some of the technical details, understand the data, etc., and put together this like prototype of a dashboard where you could see in real time all of the transactions that have went through your system, what the path they followed, what's the most common path, and what are some of these like variations or potential anomalies look like. So at a quick glance, you could instantly see kind of everything going on in your business area, which I think was like an unprecedented lens that they had. And going on to like the adoption piece, I needed a way to sell this back to teams, right? So the so what question. So one of the things I tried to come on with is a metric that was easily to communicate to these teams. And something that was a pain point to a lot of teams, which is manual review, right? No one likes to do manual review. It requires hours of time. It's outside of the automation process by definition, and everyone wants to reduce it. So I came up with this metric called MER, which is manual review rate. And I use this as like a proxy to communicate the value of process mining to whatever business area I was talking in. So that was like kind of my generic metric that I go into your business, understand what manual means in your case, and try to like fit that lens through there to say, hey, if you look at this data, we can actually reduce your MER by X% by reducing these processes. So you could see what is causing the uptick in that metric, and then you could also see the specific steps that you could potentially eliminate or refactor, do process improvement, etc. And that's been like a huge hit with the businesses is getting that lens, understanding what to do with it, and then taking action.
That's really cool. That's thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so there you have it, guys. We definitely covered very awesome kind of topics from the beginning to the end of this call. Okay, thank you, Matt, so much, for partaking in this. And for those who are watching this, if you're looking for data science interview prep, check out datainterview.com. It contains courses and coaching services that can be helpful for your interview prep. And you could also email me at dan@datainterview.com if you have any questions about that.